To change the world, you first have to be brave enough to break the existing rules. Join our journey through the stories of rebels and outcasts who dared to dream of something better. Click subscribe now and join the ranks of those who dare.
I did not call anyone. I sat at the kitchen table with my reading glasses still on, the kind with the thin gold frames I bought at the drugstore 3 years ago and never replaced, and I looked at the number on the paper in front of me. The neurologist had written it by hand at the bottom of the discharge summary, right beneath the line that said moderate severity and above the line that said follow-up in 4 weeks. I folded the paper in half. Then I folded it again. Then I put it in the front pocket of my cardigan, the navy one my daughter had given me 2 Christmases ago. The one I was wearing the day I drove myself to the hospital after my left hand went numb while I was making oatmeal. I did not call my daughter until the following morning. I want to explain that because people assume the worst when they hear it. They assume I was in shock, or that I was proud, or that I was trying to protect her. I wasn't any of those things. I just knew, sitting there at that table in the silence of my own kitchen with the refrigerator humming and the late afternoon light going flat against the window, that I needed one night to be just Nora. Not someone's mother. Not someone's patient. Not a diagnosis on a piece of paper. Just a 63-year-old woman who had spent 31 years as a registered nurse and who understood better than most exactly what the word moderate meant and exactly what it did not mean. I made myself dinner. Scrambled eggs and toast. I watched the evening news. I went to bed at 9:30 and I slept, which surprised me. And in the morning I called my daughter. Her name is Suzanne. She was 34 years old that spring and she lived 20 minutes from me in a 4-bedroom house in Marietta with her husband Craig and their 2 children, my grandchildren, Lily, who was 8, and Owen, who had just turned 6. Suzanne worked part-time from home doing something with social media accounts for small businesses, which I never fully understood but which seemed to pay well enough. Craig was in logistics, whatever that meant in practice. He wore a lot of polo shirts and talked about college football teams I had no interest in. And he had, over the 6 years I had known him, never once asked me a question about myself that wasn't followed immediately by a comment about himself. But I am getting ahead of things. I called Suzanne and told her what the neurologist had said. That I'd had a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, what most people call a mini stroke, and that while I had recovered fully in terms of immediate symptoms, I would need to make some changes. Medication, monitoring, dietary adjustments, rest. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, why didn't you call me yesterday? I needed a night," I said. "Mom." She said it again, softer. "You should have called me. I'm calling you now." There was another pause. I could hear Owen in the background asking for juice. Then Suzanne said, "Okay, we need to talk. Can you come over for dinner Saturday?" I said yes. I remember thinking it was a good sign that she asked me to come to them, that she wasn't treating me like someone who needed to be handled. I drove to Marietta on Saturday with a lemon pound cake from the bakery near my house. I sat at their dining room table and we ate pasta and the children showed me drawings they had made at school. And Craig said something about the Falcons, and after dinner, once Lily and Owen were upstairs, Suzanne sat down across from me at the table and folded her hands and said what she had clearly been thinking about all week. "We want you to move in with us." I looked at her. She was looking back at me with the expression she had used since childhood, when she had decided something and was waiting for the rest of the world to agree with it. It was the same face she made at 8 years old when she announced she was going to be a veterinarian, and at 16 when she decided she wasn't going to prom, and at 27 when she told me she was marrying Craig after knowing him for 9 months. "We have the guest room," she said. "It's right next to the hall bathroom. The kids would love having you here. And it would give us peace of mind, Mom. You'd have people around." Craig, from across the table, nodded in the slow, deliberate way of someone performing agreement. I told her I would think about it. What I thought about driving home that night was the house I had lived in for 22 years, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Decatur that I had bought after my divorce, after Joel moved to Charlotte with the woman he'd met at a conference, after I had sat in the parking lot of a Kroger for 45 minutes because I couldn't make myself go inside and buy groceries for one person. I had bought that house and I had refinished the hardwood floors myself, spending 3 weekends on my knees with a rented sander. I had planted the garden in the backyard. I had built a life in those rooms that was entirely my own, entirely legible to me, entirely mine. But I also thought about the morning my hand went numb, about standing at the stove watching the oatmeal and feeling the numbness creep up from my fingers to my wrist, and thinking, with the clinical part of my brain that never fully clocks out, this is a neurological event. About the 10 minutes I spent deciding whether to call 911 or drive myself, and about how I chose to drive myself, because the idea of an ambulance in my driveway felt more alarming than the symptom. A woman alone at 63 with a cardiovascular event in her history. I called Suzanne 2 weeks later and told her I would move in. The first few months were fine, better than fine in some ways. I had dinner with my grandchildren every night. I helped Lily with her reading, and I taught Owen to tell time on an analog clock, which his parents apparently hadn't gotten around to. I cooked on Thursdays, always something from scratch, roast chicken or beef stew or the red beans and rice I'd made my whole life. I did my own laundry. I kept my room clean and my things put away, and I did not offer opinions on how the house was run unless I was asked. I watched Suzanne. I watched the way her jaw moved when Craig spoke. I watched the way she handled the children's schedules, every activity color-coded in a shared calendar on her phone, every playdate and lesson and appointment tracked with the precision of someone managing a small organization. I watched the way she smiled when Craig complimented her, quickly, the way you smile when you're relieved rather than pleased. I had 31 years of watching people. It was the primary skill of nursing, the one they didn't teach in school. You learned to see what was underneath. What was underneath. With Craig, I understood slowly. He did not raise his voice. He was never cruel in ways that announced themselves. What he did was subtler, he managed. He managed Suzanne's time, her access to friends, the social calendar, the money, the decisions about the house. He did it in the language of practicality. It just makes more sense. It's more efficient. You always do this. You know you get overwhelmed. And Suzanne, who was 34 years old and had been managing a household and 2 children, and a part-time job, and now also her mother, had stopped, somewhere along the way, arguing with him about most things. I noticed. I said nothing. The thing with Craig and the money happened in October. About 5 months after I moved in, I had, over those 5 months, contributed to the household. I bought groceries twice a month. I covered the children's extracurriculars. I paid for repairs when things came up. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like being a guest who knew she was staying longer than a weekend. In October, Craig sat down with me after dinner one evening, while Suzanne was bathing the children, and told me they were thinking of converting the bonus room above the garage into a home office for Suzanne, so she'd have a proper workspace. It would cost around $18,000. He looked at me across the kitchen island with the expression of someone presenting a reasonable proposal. I said, "That sounds like a good idea." He said, "We were thinking you might want to contribute, given that you're living here." I looked at him for a moment. "I've been contributing," I said. "Right, but this would be an investment in the property." He smiled the way he smiled, a little too wide, a little too settled. "You'd benefit from it too." I said I would think about it. I did think about it. I did think about it. I did think about it for 3 days. I thought about the equity I had in my own house, which I had rented out when I moved in with Suzanne. A decision I now understood was the luckiest thing I had done in this entire sequence of events. I thought about my savings, which I had accumulated over 31 years of working, and about the financial advisor I had worked with for 15 years, a woman named Patricia, not the Patricia you might know, a different one, who called me once a quarter and was the only person besides my doctor who knew exactly what my financial situation looked like. My financial situation looked like this. I had a pension from the hospital system. I had a 401k. I had maxed out every year for 2 decades. I had the rental income from my house. I had savings accounts and CDs and 1 modest investment portfolio. Added together, in that October, I had somewhere in the range of $2.4 million, not counting the equity in the house. I want to be clear, this is not a story about money. It is a story about what people believe about you when they decide you are dependent on them. Craig had looked at me, a 63-year-old woman who'd moved in after a health scare, who cooked on Thursdays and helped with homework, and he had decided he understood my situation completely. He had decided I was grateful in the way that requires a price. He was wrong. I said nothing about any of this. I told Craig I wasn't in a position to contribute to renovations, and he nodded in the practiced way of someone filing information away. After that, things shifted. It happened the way these things always happen, gradually and then in ways that were impossible to ignore. Suzanne began scheduling things on weekday evenings without mentioning them to me. Book club, a work dinner, a neighbor's birthday gathering. And I would find out at 4 in the afternoon that I was expected to handle the children's dinner and bedtime, which I did because I love Lily and Owen, and I was not going to take on my frustration on a 6 and 8-year-old. But I noticed Craig started making comments at dinner about the cost of the household. Subtle things. Groceries are really something lately, said while I was passing the salad. Utilities are brutal this winter, said to no one in particular. I had been a nurse for 3 decades. I had worked with people in pain, people in fear, people trying to manage situations they couldn't control. I recognized the behavior. It was the behavior of someone who wanted something and was building a case. The case, I understood, was for me to be more financially useful. And then my left hand went numb again. It was a Tuesday morning in February, 7 months after I'd moved in. I was making coffee and I felt it, that same crawling absence from my fingers to my wrist, and I sat down immediately at the kitchen table and waited, watching the clock, counting seconds. It resolved in 4 minutes. Shorter than the first time. I called my neurologist from the kitchen table and they saw me that afternoon. Not a second TIA. A medication interaction, the neurologist believed. They adjusted my prescriptions and told me to schedule a follow-up in 6 weeks. I was fine. I am fine. But I sat in the exam room for a long time after the neurologist left, in the particular quiet of a medical office, and I thought about what it meant to be fine. I called my tenant on the drive home and asked about her lease renewal timeline. Then I called my financial advisor and we talked for 45 minutes. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 days later. It was a Thursday night, late. I had cooked dinner, short ribs, which take hours and which I had been making since before Suzanne was born. After dinner, I went upstairs earlier than usual because I was tired, genuinely tired in the bone-deep way of someone whose body had recently reminded her that it had its own opinions. I was reading in bed when I heard Suzanne and Craig talking in the hallway outside my door. I want to be precise about this. I was not eavesdropping. My door was not fully closed. Sound travels in that house the way it travels in all houses built in the last 20 years, with their thin walls and open floor plans and the architectural illusion of spaciousness. I heard them because they were not being careful. Craig said, "I'm just saying it's been almost 8 months and the situation isn't sustainable." Suzanne said something I couldn't hear clearly. Craig said, "She's not contributing the way we talked about." And now with the scare again. I mean, what happens if this escalates? Are you going to be her nurse? Is that the plan? Suzanne said, lower. She's my mother. I know she is. But we didn't sign up to run a care facility. If she needs that level of monitoring, she should be somewhere with professionals. That's not what we agreed to. A pause. Then Craig, quieter. I think we need to have a real conversation with her about what the arrangement looks like going forward, because right now we're absorbing costs and stress. And it's not, he stopped. Then she should be thinking about what her plan is, whether that's assisted living or... I stopped reading. I lay there in the bed in the dark room, in the house that smelled like the short ribs I had spent 3 hours cooking. And I thought about the phrase we didn't sign up to run a care facility. I thought about what it meant that my son-in-law had said those words 2 days after my neurologist told me I had not, in fact, had a second TIA. I thought about the complete picture Craig had of me in his mind. A sick old woman running out her clock in their guest room. I did not make a sound. Suzanne did not come to speak to me that night, nor the next morning. She was quiet at breakfast, in the way she was sometimes quiet, focused on the children, moving efficiently, not meeting my eyes for longer than a moment. I watched her. I'd been watching her for 8 months. I knew this particular quiet. It was the quiet of someone who had heard something they couldn't unhear and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. I drove to my financial advisor's office that Friday afternoon, and we finished the conversation we had started on the phone. Let me tell you what I've been thinking about since February, since that Tuesday morning when my hand went numb again, and I sat in the exam room and thought about what it meant to be fine. I had been thinking about my house in Decatur, about my tenant whose lease ended in April, about the fact that 31 years of nursing at a level 2 trauma center leaves a person with a particular relationship to the idea of contingency planning. You plan. You always plan. Not because you assume the worst, but because the worst does not wait for you to be ready. By the end of March, I had given my tenant notice, politely and with the appropriate time as specified in her lease. I had spent 3 Saturdays driving around Decatur and Avondale Estates and Stone Mountain looking at smaller properties, condos mostly. One small house near Clarkston that had a garden space I liked. I had conversations with 2 real estate agents. I made no announcements. I cooked on Thursdays. I helped Lily with fractions. I taught Owen to tie his shoes using the bunny ears method, which is slower but more reliable for small hands. I drove them to school on Tuesdays when Suzanne had early meetings. I did all of this not as performance, not as documentation, but because I loved those children, and because I was their grandmother, and because the situation between me and Craig was not their situation, and I was not going to let it become theirs. In April, I made an offer on a condominium in Avondale Estates, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a small covered patio that faced east, which is the correct direction for morning light. The HOA fee was reasonable. The building had an elevator. There was a room with good natural light that I intended to use for my sewing, which I had not done in nearly a year because I had not had space that was my own. The offer was accepted on a Tuesday. I paid cash. I want to explain the cash because I understand it surprises people. I am not wealthy in the way that word is typically meant. I did not inherit money. I did not marry money. I worked. I worked for 31 years in a field that asks a great deal of the body and even more of the spirit, and I worked without the cushion of a second income for most of those years after the divorce. And I was careful with what I earned in the way that people who've been genuinely frightened by financial instability learn to be careful. The condo cost $480,000. I paid it from savings and the proceeds of a CD that had matured the previous fall. I told Suzanne on a Saturday morning in early May, after the children had gone to their swimming lessons with Craig. We were sitting at the kitchen table with our coffee. It was the same table where I had eaten short ribs last February. The same table where Craig had talked to me about the bonus room renovation. The light was good. I remember that clearly. I said, I need to tell you something. I'm moving out. I've bought a condo in Avondale Estates. I'll be moving my things on the 15th. Suzanne put down her cup. She looked at me in a way I had not seen her look at me since she was very young. A look that was just raw, with none of the management of it. Mom, she said. The condo is nice, I said. 2 bedrooms. The second room will be for when the kids visit. I'd like them to visit. Mom, is this because? She stopped. Her hands around the cup were still. Did you hear us? Last month? I heard Craig, I said. And I heard you not answer him. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, I could hear a lawnmower somewhere on the street. Then she said, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, I said. I've made my decision, and it's a good decision, and it's a good decision, and I'm not asking for your opinion on it. I paused. But I'm asking you something else. She looked up. I want you to think about the life you're living, I said. Not the schedule of it, not the logistics, the actual life. Whether it is the life you chose or the life that was arranged around you while you were busy managing everything else. She didn't answer. I didn't expect her to. Not right then. I moved out on the 15th of May, a Thursday. I cooked one last dinner before I left. Roast chicken. The simple kind. Just the bird with lemon and garlic and a bunch of fresh thyme tucked underneath the skin. I made it for the children who ate at the table with me and told me about their week. Lily asked me why I was moving, and I told her I had found a place that was exactly the right size for me, and that she could help me pick out the curtains for her room when she came to visit. She said she wanted purple curtains. I said that was an excellent choice. Craig was not at dinner. Suzanne told me he was working late, and I accepted this without comment. What happened afterward happened at the pace that real things happen, which is not the pace of dramatic revelation. It took time. In June, Suzanne called me and we talked for 2 hours. She cried for part of it, and I let her, and I did not try to fix it. In July, she called again, and she told me she had started seeing a therapist, alone. Not couples therapy, just her own therapist for herself. I told her I thought that was a brave thing to do. In September, she called me and told me she had some things she wanted to say and asked if she could come over. I said yes. She sat on my small couch in my condo and she said she was sorry. Not the quick sorry, not the sorry that is really asking to be forgiven fast so everyone can move on. She said she was sorry for not coming to my room that night after she heard Craig, for letting the silence stand, for choosing, in that moment and in some others she named specifically, to manage me rather than to stand with me. I listened. I'd spent 31 years listening to people in the specific way that means you actually hear them. Then I told her something I had thought about many times since that night in February, when I lay in the dark in their guest room with the smell of short ribs in the air. I told her that I understood. I told her that what I had seen in her marriage over 8 months was not something I could solve. And it was not something she was going to solve in a conversation. And I was not going to pretend otherwise. I told her that I loved her and that I was her mother and that those two things were permanent in a way that Craig's opinions about assisted living were not. She laughed at that a little. The wet kind of laugh that comes after crying. We had dinner together that night. The two of us at my kitchen table. I made the red beans and rice. After dinner we sat on the covered patio and watched the light go down, the good eastern light from morning now turned to a warm amber coming from the west and bouncing off the building across the courtyard. And we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. An old family trip to St. Simon's Island. A teacher Suzanne had in 3rd grade. The way my own mother had made cornbread in a cast iron skillet that I had kept and still used and would one day give to Lily. The children started visiting on weekends in October. Lily chose purple curtains and I took her to the fabric store and we picked out a lavender with small white flowers that was, I thought, exactly right. Owen decided the half bathroom was his bathroom when he visited and put a small frog figurine on the back of the toilet tank as a claim marker. I let him keep it there. My health, for the record, has been stable. I see my neurologist every 4 months and my cardiologist twice a year and I take my medications without fail, which is the thing I tell my former patients when they ask me the single most important thing a person can do for their cardiovascular health. You take the medication. You do not skip it because you feel fine. You do not skip it because it is inconvenient. You take it because feeling fine is often the result of taking it, not evidence that you no longer need it. I walk 3 mornings a week around the neighborhood and through a small park that has a pond with ducks that appear to have no fear of humans whatsoever. I started sewing again. I finished a quilt that I had begun before my divorce. An abandoned and carried with me through 6 moves over 20 years. A double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams that I stitched the last panels of on a Saturday afternoon in December, with the winter light coming low through my east-facing window. I thought about the 20 years the quilt had sat folded in a bag, about all the things that had happened in that time, about what it had cost me, and what I had built in spite of it. Then I folded the quilt and put it on the bed in Lily's room with the purple curtains, and I put on the kettle, and I called my daughter. People ask me sometimes if I regret moving in with my daughter in the first place. I understand why they ask. The answer is no, and I mean that without reservation. What happened in that house over 8 months taught me things I could not have learned any other way. Not about Craig. I had a sense of Craig fairly early. What it taught me was about the particular blindness that comes from being needed. When you are useful to people, genuinely useful in the daily physical way of cooking and childcare and school pickup, it is easy to mistake that usefulness for belonging. I had made that mistake. I had allowed the warmth of my grandchildren's company and the rhythm of a full household to stand in for something I had quietly stopped building in my own life. A place that was unconditionally mine. The morning my hand went numb the second time, sitting at that kitchen table in Marietta with someone else's coffee mugs on someone else's shelves. I understood something I should have understood sooner. You cannot outsource your own foundation. You can let people completely. You can give generously. You can be present in every way that matters, and still need to have ground underneath your own feet that no one else can shift. What Craig did was not complicated. He looked at a 63-year-old woman who had moved in after a health scare, and he saw a liability dressed up as a grandmother. That is a failure of character, and it is his to carry. But what I did in response had nothing to do with Craig. It had to do with 31 years of understanding that the body keeps its own accounting, that the things you defer, the quilt unfinished, the sewing room never made, the mornings that belong to no one but yourself, they do not disappear. They wait. And eventually you either return to them or you don't, and the not returning has a cost that compounds quietly over time. I bought that condo because I had earned it, not because I was angry, not to make a point, not to hurt anyone. Because I had worked for 31 years and been careful with what I made, and it was time, genuinely time, to stop treating my own security as something secondary to other people's comfort. Suzanne's apology mattered to me, not because I needed to be apologized to, but because she meant it. She meant the specific thing, the silence in the hallway, the choice she made and knew she had made. That kind of honesty is not easy, and I did not take it lightly. What I hope for her, what I think about when I watch her with Lily and Owen, is that she finds her own ground underneath her, that she stops managing and starts choosing. Those are different things, and the difference is everything. Lily has purple curtains in the room she sleeps in when she visits. Owen's frog is still in the back of my half-bathroom toilet tank. I walk 3 mornings a week past a pond with ducks that have no fear. I finished a quilt I started before my divorce. The quilt took 20 years. The condo took a phone call and a wire transfer and a Tuesday afternoon signing papers at a table with good light. Some things are slow. Some things, once you are ready, are not slow at all.